Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Barbara lives in an orphanage with her brother and sister. They wanted to adopt her sister, and the children run away to stay together forever. One day, while rummaging through trash bins looking for food, Barbara finds a wallet stuffed with money. What she decides to do with it changes their lives forever. Barbara looked up at the sky and frowned. She had just stepped outside 10 minutes ago, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky, but now the first raindrops were falling onto the asphalt. The air had a distinct damp smell. The girl sighed. It hadn't rained for nearly 3 weeks. One didn't need to be a meteorologist to guess that her old cotton dress would be soaked through in a few minutes. She immediately wanted to go back home, but she couldn't. Bruno and Carolina would wake up soon and want food, and Barbara, being the eldest, had to take care of them, including getting food. "All right, just a little more," Barbara muttered to herself, quickening her pace. She had already reached the huge backyard, nearly entirely occupied by rows of tall trash bins. Barbara had discovered this place by pure chance. Twice a week, expired food from a large grocery store was dumped into these bins. It was an expensive supermarket. Unlike the cheap ones, the food there was of good quality, and most of it had only expired a day or two ago. Of course, Barbara knew that Bruno and Carolina had eaten all sorts of things, but if she had the chance to feed them proper food, it would be a sin not to take advantage of it. But she had to hurry. Exactly 15 minutes after the expired food was discarded, a truck arrived to pick it all up and take it away. This time, Barbara made it in time. She quickly took off her old faded backpack. She had sewn the straps back onto it several times herself, so she knew that no matter how much she put inside, the bag would hold up. Today's haul was good: a couple of packs of cottage cheese pancakes with cherry jam, a pack of chicken thighs, a slightly rotten but still edible mango, a stick of smoked sausage, and a large bag of tomato juice. Barbara was especially happy about the last one. The kids wouldn't drink it, but she loved it. Once everything was packed into the backpack, Barbara prepared to head back. If she was lucky, she would get home before the rain really started. Suddenly, something in one of the bins caught her attention. Barbara reached out and pulled out a strange wallet. It was bright green, like spring grass, and glossy. On the front of the wallet, there was a bright crimson flower, its petals tied together with yarn. "Well, well," Barbara said aloud, "what a creative imagination people have." She suddenly laughed. After such a long time, she found a wallet, and instead of rushing to see what was inside, she was thinking about how stylish it was. Sighing, she opened it. Inside, there were several large bills. Barbara gasped. They could live off this for months, even if she never went hunting for expired food again. Besides the money, there was a small, old coin that had been issued many years ago. Who could have lost such a strange wallet? Barbara looked around, hid the wallet in the inner pocket of her backpack, put it on her shoulders, and headed toward home. The rain was picking up. Barbara turned her head from side to side, trying to think of a place to wait out the rain. She was fine, not made of sugar, she wouldn't melt. But the food. The only shelter seemed to be an old bus stop with a roof and one wall. It wouldn't warm her up, but it would work to wait out the rain. When Barbara stepped under the roof, she saw a woman she hadn't noticed from a distance. The woman looked at her curiously. A gypsy, Barbara thought with some superstitious fear. The woman appeared to be around 45, of average height, large, with shiny black eyes and dark brown hair, a bit darker than Barbara's own. She wore a bright red, voluminous skirt, a blue blouse, and a colorful scarf on her head. "Waiting for the bus, beautiful?" she asked Barbara cheerfully. "The next one won't be for another half hour." "How do you know?" Barbara asked. "Can you see the future?" The gypsy suddenly threw her head back and laughed loudly with a deep, hoarse voice. A gold tooth flashed in her mouth. Before she stopped laughing, she waved her hand, and Barbara saw an electronic timetable. Indeed, the next bus was in 29 minutes. The girl felt foolish. "Sorry," she muttered, turning away. Just wish this stupid rain would stop. The kids have probably already woken up and are wondering where I've gone. No, of course, they would figure out that Barbara had gone for food and probably guessed to heat up the stove, as there should still be some wood left. Don't be mad at me, beautiful, the gypsy's low voice suddenly sounded again. I can see the future too, but I don't like using my gift unless necessary. Well, here it comes, Barbara thought. She'll offer to read my fortune and then ask me to pay her. She was about to say that she didn't need anything, but the gypsy said something that Barbara didn't expect. You found an object today, the woman said thoughtfully. And you didn't find it by accident. Barbara turned around in fear. How did she know about the wallet? Was this some kind of setup? The gypsy looked strange. She didn't even look at Barbara. Her face was frozen, like a mask, and her black eyes were staring somewhere into the distance. Only her lips barely moved. Find the owner of this item, the gypsy continued, and it will change your destiny. Then, she suddenly exhaled sharply, and her body seemed to relax all at once. She looked at Barbara with a smile. Look, the rain stopped, said the gypsy. Run home, the kids are probably hungry. An empty bus pulled up to the stop. The woman got in and drove away. Barbara looked at the bus number, then glanced at the electronic timetable. There were still 23 minutes until the next bus, and the number of the bus that took the gypsy was not even on the list. I'll go home, Barbara thought, and almost ran away from the bus stop. The place where they lived together was hard to call a real home. They called it that more out of habit, probably to keep the illusion that they actually had a home. In reality, it was part of an old city district, a very old one. There were several wooden houses there, still heated with stoves. These houses had been deemed uninhabitable about 15 years ago. The residents were relocated, and the houses were about to be demolished to make way for a new district of high-rise buildings. However, during the area's analysis, it was discovered that the conditions were completely unsuitable, and the cost of constructing new buildings would be unjustifiably high, so the old houses were left alone. Besides Barbara, Bruno, and Carolina, a few other homeless people also lived there. The electricity in the uninhabited area had been cut off long ago, and only the stoves were still in use. Fuel was either gathered from nearby trees or from houses that had already collapsed due to age and were clearly uninhabitable. Some people had been living there for more than 10 years. Barbara had found this place about a year ago. Before that, they had been living in basements, shelters, and other places that were not very suitable for young children. Now, Barbara was 21 years old. Bruno was 12, and Carolina was only 9. The younger ones were biological siblings, while Barbara was not related to them by blood, but that didn't stop her from loving and caring for them as if they were her own. Barbara had grown up in an orphanage. She didn't remember her parents, and the caretakers never told her how she ended up there or whether she had any other relatives. She didn't have many good memories of the orphanage. The children there, from a young age, were divided into small groups, and each group fought with the others. Barbara didn't like this, so she always kept to herself. She never made any friends or even acquaintances. All the free time she had from school and housework was spent in a small library that hardly anyone else visited. For being different from the others, Barbara was constantly picked on. She was small, thin, with brown eyes and chestnut curls, and didn't stand out much among the other orphans. But because she didn't join any group, the other children didn't like her. Complaining to the caretakers was useless. They believed that harsh living conditions would help the children adapt to the reality they would face in adult life. When Barbara turned 16, she ran away and started living on the streets. And she probably would have had a very hard time if it wasn't for the old man, Diego. It was Diego who noticed her, frozen at the train station where she had been sleeping for almost a week, barely eating anything. Grandpa Diego took her in, and from then on, they started traveling together. They rarely stayed in one place for more than a few weeks. Barbara liked that life. It seemed like Grandpa Diego knew every city they visited. When Barbara asked him how he became homeless, he would just shrug. Life turned out this way, darling. Grandpa Diego was a strong believer that life, fate, or the universe knew better than people did. Pay attention to the signs, he would tell Barbara. They're everywhere. If you listen to your intuition, you'll never go wrong. He claimed that was how he met Barbara. On that day, I was actually heading to a different station, Grandpa Diego would say. There was a freight train heading south. I'd ridden on it several times and knew exactly where to sit to get to where I needed to go. But then, suddenly, it was like a thought hit me out of nowhere, telling me to go to this station. That's how I met you. At first, Barbara was skeptical about Diego's words. She did well in school, read a lot of books, and believed that people could control their own destiny. All this talk about signs, astrologers, and fortune tellers seemed like nonsense. But Diego's intuition never seemed to fail. One time, for example, he woke her up in the middle of the night and told her it was time to leave. Where to, Grandpa Diego? Barbara protested sleepily. Let's sleep for another couple of hours and then go. The old man sighed and shook his head. We need to go, Barbara. I sense trouble is coming. And this happened a few more times. Each time, Barbara sighed but got up. And a day or two later, they would hear through word of mouth that at the shelter they had left, a mass fight had broken out. Not just any fight. Several people were injured. Either the police raided the place, or there had been a fire. How do you do it, Grandpa Diego? Barbara would ask her companion. What's your secret? The old man would just shrug. It's like there's no special secret. I don't have magical instincts. I think it's a feeling everyone has. People just get used to suppressing it, and I prefer to listen to it. Sometimes, you're walking to a certain place, and inside, you feel like something's twisting, pulling you in another direction. And what do most people do in that case? They suppress those feelings and keep walking. But when I feel that, I turn around and walk away from there. I'll try it sometime, Barbara said thoughtfully. Try, my dear, Grandpa nodded. Or sometimes, you're at a crossroads, not sure whether to go left or right. Listen carefully to yourself, and you'll feel which way pulls you more. That's the way to go. Barbara lived with Grandpa Diego for 3 whole years. Then, the old man caught a cold, fell ill, and died. He seemed to have known about his death in advance. He purposely sent Barbara on an errand so she wouldn't see it. Barbara cried for a long time when she found him. Then, she wiped away her tears, packed her things, and moved on, trying to follow where her intuition led her. It wasn't even a week before she met Bruno and Carolina. Their fate was similar to hers. The brother and sister ended up in an orphanage when Carolina was just a year old and Bruno was 4. They always tried to stick together, with Bruno always looking out for Carolina. But a few years later, when Bruno was 11 and Carolina was 8, a family came along and wanted to adopt the girl alone, without her brother. That's when they ran away. I was ready, Bruno later told Barbara. I'd be fine if she ended up with them. But Carolina cried for days. She said that if they took her alone, she'd run away and find me. I couldn't risk that. It's definitely easier to be together. I'll protect her. It's unknown how long the children would have survived alone on the streets and how much worse it could have gotten if they hadn't met Barbara. She decided then that it was fate. Just as Diego had once become her guardian and protector, she, still a child herself, took these two under her wing. And within a few months, they found this abandoned district. They chose a small, inconspicuous house that was still solid enough and started living there. From Diego, Barbara learned how to heat the stove and cook. Everything she knew, she taught to Bruno and Carolina. Now, they mostly handled the household chores, while Barbara took on the responsibility of providing food and clothing. She tried not to do anything illegal, understanding that if the police took her, the kids wouldn't survive without her. So the only option left was to find stores with expired products, take on temporary jobs, and seek help from free food kitchens and assistance centers. But deep down, Barbara believed that this wasn't permanent. One day, a good streak would come into her life. She just had to believe in it and trust her intuition, as Grandpa Diego had taught her. And now, she had found this wallet. When the children were fed, Barbara retreated to her little corner. Their house was small, but each of them had their own little personal space. To create these spaces, they simply hammered in a few nails, stretched some ropes, and hung old sheets as makeshift curtains. "Well, here we have a 4-room apartment," Bruno had joked. 3 bedrooms and a living room. "Yeah," Barbara had replied. "Too bad the toilet's outside." The girl climbed into her bed and pulled the makeshift curtains shut. She was now certain that she needed to find the owner of the wallet. But how? And why should she? The money inside was enough to last them for several months. Not every benefit is immediately obvious, she suddenly remembered Diego's words. Often, if you dig a little deeper, you'll get much more than you would have at first glance. Barbara decided not to spend the money from the wallet, even though it wouldn't hurt. The kids needed new shoes, they were growing fast. And she herself could use some new clothes. Maybe then they'd even hire her for a job, as a courier or something like that. No, she told herself firmly. I'll find the wallet's owner. But how should I do it? She could go to the supermarket and ask the cashiers if they had seen a customer with such a wallet. It was noticeable, but it was unlikely anyone would remember something like that. Even if they did remember and describe the person, what would Barbara do with this information? She could go to the police, but there was no guarantee they wouldn't keep it for themselves or simply refuse to open a case, saying they had enough work already. Even if they did take the case, how would they find the owner? Barbara sighed and turned the wallet over in her hands again. This time, she noticed a small, almost hidden compartment inside. She opened it and pulled out a small business card. On the expensive, thick black card, the address was printed in gold, elegant letters. Barbara didn't know where the street with such a name was, but it wasn't hard to guess that this address could provide some information about the wallet's owner. She decided she would go there tomorrow. There, it would be clear if the strange gypsy had lied to her or not. "You're going somewhere again early in the morning," Carolina said sadly. "There's food, stay, take the day off." Barbara smiled. "I need to finish a little task," she said. "Don't worry, it's nothing illegal. If everything goes well, I think I'll be able to take a few days off." Carolina frowned. "What if it doesn't go well?" she asked. Barbara shrugged. "Then everything stays the same. You and Bruno make breakfast, lunch if necessary, and don't go too far. I might be back soon." The little girl sighed. "All right," she said. "Don't worry, we won't disappear." Barbara searched for the right street for a long time. Eventually, she realized the house she needed was in another part of the city. Essentially, it was in a separate district with large, wealthy private homes. Barbara immediately imagined how she might be kicked out of there. But this time, luck was on her side. Barbara quietly slipped past the security booth, stepped over the lowered barrier, and walked down the long, empty street. It was already approaching noon, and the heat was becoming unbearable. That's probably why there was no one around. When Barbara reached the house she needed, she stopped, confused. What should she do next? A solid high metal fence hid the house from curious eyes. Of course, the gates were closed. After looking around, the girl saw a doorbell button and, hesitating, pressed it. It took almost a minute before a stern, dry voice came through the speaker. "Yes?" Barbara was startled, but gathered her courage and answered. "I found your wallet." "What wallet?" "The green one, glossy, with a bright knitted flower. There was also an old coin inside." She thought she heard a heavy sigh on the other side of the speaker. "Come in," the man said. There was a beep, and the gates clicked open. Barbara stepped inside. Beyond the fence was a small but modern wooden house. On the porch stood a man, frowning, looking at Barbara. He seemed to be about 35 or 40 years old. His dark red hair, like his short beard, had a few gray strands. His blue eyes watched her from behind thin, metallic-framed glasses. Despite the heat, the stranger was wearing a plaid shirt and dark blue jeans. "Hello," Barbara said cautiously. He nodded. "Where did you find it?" the man asked. "In the trash bin behind the store." "What were you doing in the trash bin?" Barbara blushed. The man nodded, as if the answer was obvious. Suddenly, the girl clearly realized what she looked like: old, nearly falling apart sneakers, a faded dress, and a patched-up backpack. Silently, she handed the wallet to its owner. He took it, opened it, and grunted. "Have you ever thought," the man continued, "that if someone throws away a wallet full of money, they don't want it to be returned?" Barbara raised her eyebrows in surprise. "So you deliberately threw it away?" He nodded. "But why?" He frowned. "The interesting question is, why did you return it, especially with the money? From your appearance, it's clear that you need the money more than I do. Even if we assume you're particularly sentimental, you could have brought back the wallet and claimed there was no money inside. At first, I planned to do that, but then I suddenly felt that it would be more right to return it to its owner. And I believe that you should always act according to what feels right." He suddenly sighed and took off his glasses. He rubbed his nose, and with that simple gesture, he lost all his harshness. Well, he said. "Another one who believes in fate. Let's go inside." The man waved his hand invitingly, and Barbara hesitated before following him. Inside, everything was made of wood, very cozy and clean. "Cold lemonade," the owner of the house said, and handed her a large glass filled with a drink with ice and lemon slices. The lemonade was very refreshing in the heat. "Thank you," Barbara said after finishing the glass. "What's your name?" the man suddenly asked. "Barbara." An unusual name. For a homeless person? Barbara asked. He smiled slightly. "No, just a rare name. My name is Federico Lorenzo." Barbara nodded. "Nice to meet you. I've heard your name quite a few times. By any chance, do you need a job?" She tensed up and blushed. "I'm not like that. I need money, but not enough to lower myself to doing something despicable." The man sighed and rolled his eyes. "You're not my type. Are you even 18? I'm not into that. I need a housekeeper. My previous maid just quit, and it's hard to find a decent one." Barbara squinted suspiciously. "And you'll just take me off the street like this? You're clever. You found me after all. Honest, since you decided to return what you easily could have kept. Persistent, since you made it here. And also, I believe in fate. Since this wallet came back to me through you, then for some reason, it was meant to happen." Barbara thought for a moment. Despite his apparent strictness, she didn't feel any danger from Federico. After so many years living on the streets, she had learned to recognize the people she should avoid. The owner of the wallet definitely wasn't one of them. "What would I need to do?" Barbara asked. "Nothing complicated. Cook for me, clean the house, go shopping. Every day? Monday through Friday." Barbara thought it over. A job wouldn't hurt. Carolina and Bruno were old enough to handle things during the day without her. And in the future, who knows? Maybe she could save some money and rent a proper place for the three of them. "I agree." "Then it's a deal." Barbara carefully shook his firm, dry hand. The homeowner took all the money from the wallet and handed it to Barbara. "This is an advance. Buy yourself some decent clothes and shoes. If the security stops you, tell them to call me. I'll confirm everything. I expect you here tomorrow at 8 a.m., understood?" Barbara nodded. Her heart was pounding. "Yes, I'll be there," she said, still not believing this was really happening. "Thank you." "Not yet for anything. Don't be late, Barbara." Barbara didn't spend all the money she received from her new employer right away. Who knew how things would turn out? Of course, she bought some food for the kids for the time being: grains, pasta, sausages, tea, milk, a pack of cookies, and a bag of candy. They didn't have a refrigerator, nor electricity. So, anything that could spoil quickly was stored in the basement. Also, Barbara finally updated their wardrobe. She found 3 decent pairs of sneakers in secondhand stores. She got Bruno jeans, shorts, and a couple of t-shirts, Carolina a couple of dresses. She spent more than anyone else, since Federico had clearly made it clear she needed to look presentable. Barbara still hadn't figured out exactly what Federico did for a living, but he was definitely not poor. Therefore, he wouldn't tolerate having his maid look like a homeless person. "You won't starve without me, will you?" she asked the kids in the evening. They were busy trying on their new clothes. "Of course not," Bruno replied indignantly. "We're grown up now. Maybe if you have a job, you could adopt us?" Carolina asked dreamily. Although she was the youngest, Carolina always talked about adult matters more than Barbara and Bruno together. "Yeah, right," Bruno scoffed. "Barbara is only 21, we don't have a place to live, and it's not like they pay housekeepers enough to support 3 people. Barbara sighed. "I'll probably be working unofficially," she said. "I don't have any documents." Carolina's face fell in disappointment. Seeing this, Bruno immediately put his hand on her shoulder. "Everything will be fine," he said firmly to his sister. Barbara smiled. "Just in case, I'll write down the address and draw a map on how to get there," she said, "and I'll leave a bit of money." "How will you get there yourself?" Bruno frowned. "By 8 in the morning." The girl smiled. "Nothing to worry about. I'll go to bed early today and get up early tomorrow." This time, the guard noticed her. "Who are you here for, miss?" he asked sternly. Barbara stopped. What if Federico was just messing with her and now she's going to be kicked out in shame? "Who are you here for, miss?" the man at the booth repeated, louder and more irritated. "To Senor Lorenzo," Barbara replied. "Oh, to Federico Lorenzo? Go ahead, he's expecting you." She nodded and hurried in. As soon as she pressed the familiar doorbell, the gates almost immediately opened, as if they were waiting for her. Barbara took a deep breath and entered. "Well, you're not late," Federico said with satisfaction. "Did you have breakfast?" Barbara hesitantly nodded. She left the house early, and the stove, the only thing they could cook on, hadn't been lit yet. "I see," sighed the host. "Let's go to the kitchen, I'll show you everything. You'll figure something out for both of us. By the way, nice dress." "Thank you," Barbara replied. They quickly figured out the stove, microwave, slow cooker, and other appliances. Although Barbara had rarely used any of this, she quickly understood how everything worked. Half an hour later, 2 large mugs of strong coffee were steaming on the table, 2 plates of fluffy omelets were set, and Barbara also made a few crispy toasts with cheese and bacon. "You've got a talent," Federico exclaimed. "Even an experienced cook wouldn't make it like this." "Thanks," Barbara blushed. "I'm glad you liked it." "Well, now that we've eaten, we can work," said the host cheerfully. He gave Barbara a brief tour, showing her the rooms while explaining what could be done where. "A good cleaning wouldn't hurt here," Federico concluded cheerfully. "It's been a while since I had an assistant. The only thing you shouldn't touch is my desk. I'll deal with that myself. I'll be working in the garden, so if you have any questions, find me there." He grabbed his laptop and left. Barbara gathered her hair into a bun and took all the necessary cleaning supplies from the closet under the stairs. She had never cleaned such houses before. Her own living space could hardly be called a home. She and the guys used to mop the floors, sweep, and occasionally clean the windows. And all of that with no cleaning supplies, just old rags and some baking soda. By the way, Barbara had great respect for baking soda. It could clean practically everything. She'd also worked as a cleaner a few times, usually for technical rooms or snack bars. Once, she worked in a roadside cafe for almost 2 weeks, and then the owner started hitting on her. That same evening, Barbara told her grandfather Diego what happened. He frowned and said she wouldn't go there again. The next morning, they packed their things and moved to another city. Years later, when Barbara returned alone to that city, she learned that the cafe had burned down in a fire. It happened right after they left the city that night. Cleaning turned out to be not so difficult. It was clear that Federico lived alone, and apart from dust, there was no other mess in the house. However, in his office, there were framed photos on the walls. Barbara guessed that one of them featured Federico's parents, him, about 5 years old, and presumably his older sister. There was also a picture that caught Barbara's attention. Federico was hugging a pretty light-haired, gray-eyed woman, and standing in front of them was a girl, about 10 years old. Must be his wife and daughter, Barbara thought. How many years ago was this picture taken? 10 years, maybe. That means we're about the same age. Naturally, Barbara was curious about where the employer's wife and daughter were now. Maybe they lived in the city, or maybe they were on vacation. Or perhaps Federico had divorced his wife and the daughter stayed with her. The last option seemed the most likely because there were no women's or children's things in the house. Barbara decided not to ask about it for now. Probably, if the homeowner wanted to share that information, he would tell her. The wallet probably belonged to his daughter. But why did he throw it away? Did they have a falling out? She didn't touch his desk, but she glanced at it and saw a pile of crossed-out documents with notes written in red pencil in the margins. Barbara couldn't help herself, took a look, and realized it seemed like a script for films or TV shows. "Are you a screenwriter?" Barbara asked Federico when she came to find him in the garden to invite him to lunch. He absent-mindedly looked up at her, and his eyes behind his glasses flashed angrily. "You're quite curious, Barbara," the host remarked, though not very irritated. "No, I'm not a screenwriter." Barbara nodded, waiting for more. Federico, realizing he'd have to answer the question, sighed. "I used to be one. Now I'm more of a teacher, mentor, call it what you want. I check the work of young screenwriters. I point out mistakes, highlight good parts, rewrite unsuccessful scenes, endings, and so on." "That's an interesting job," Barbara said thoughtfully. "Well, it only seems that way," Federico replied thoughtfully. "In reality, I sometimes go crazy from it. Shall we have lunch?" "Of course. That's why I invited you," Barbara replied immediately. "Now that's better. I didn't feed you, and you're asking." When they entered the house, the host looked around in surprise. Well, he said. "Barbara, are you sure you've never worked as a maid before?" "No," the girl replied. "It's just that cleaning isn't as hard as checking scripts. No special skills or experience needed." Federico laughed. Barbara returned home late in the evening. She had spent an hour on the bus. Fortunately, the kids were fine. "Well, how was it?" Carolina asked as soon as she entered. "All is well," Barbara smiled. "It seems I've found a real, proper job." "Yay!" Carolina rushed to hug her, and Barbara laughed and kissed the girl on the cheek. "I knew everything would be fine," Bruno said. "How are things with you?" The kids exchanged glances and shrugged. "It's boring," Carolina concluded. "We just eat and sleep all day and go out to play a bit." Barbara sighed. "You should be going to school." "But it's summer now," Bruno pointed out reasonably. "And in the fall, you won't just get us a school place, right?" Carolina added. "I know," Barbara replied. "But I'll figure something out. I don't want you to live like this your whole life." The next week, the kids adjusted to their new routine. Barbara gradually got used to going to bed early and waking up early. She spent less time with the kids, but they didn't mind and tried to entertain themselves. Her communication with Federico also gradually improved. He praised her cooking and cleaning, and sometimes, when he was in a good mood, he even told her something about his work. "By the way, where do you live?" her employer asked one day. At that moment, Barbara was taking dishes out of the dishwasher. Her hand shook, and at the last moment, she dropped a mug. It was Federico's favorite mug, and it definitely shouldn't have been dropped. "Barbara," the host said sternly, "just be honest. We agreed on this, didn't we?" The girl wrinkled her nose. "That's a personal question. If you want to ask me personal questions, I'll ask you personal ones too." Federico's eyebrows shot up. "Look at you, getting bold after a week of work," he remarked. But he immediately softened. "All right, I'll let it go. We live in an abandoned house, a wooden block behind the river." "Is that the one they were going to demolish, but then they found the soil wasn't suitable for high-rises?" Barbara nodded. "Wow. What time do you wake up to get here by 8? Federico asked. 6. "Do you want to start later?" the boss suddenly asked. "At 9 or 10? Barbara shook her head. "No, I'm fine. I'm already used to it." "Okay. You said we. Who else lives with you? A husband? A boyfriend?" She didn't want to talk about the kids, but it was too late to back out. "I live with 2 kids. Bruno and Carolina. They're orphans too." "You're not related?" "They're siblings, but I'm not a blood relative. Still, they're like family to me." "I see. How old are they?" 9 and 12. Federico's face suddenly became thoughtful. Barbara immediately regretted sharing this with him. She decided to distract him. "By the way, why doesn't your wife and daughter visit?" she asked sharply. "The wallet belongs to your daughter." The boss frowned. "Nice diversion," he said thoughtfully. "Good move, and you're not as simple as you seem, my dear." "You said I could ask you personal questions too," Barbara parried. "All right, clever one, you got me there," Federico sighed. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I'm divorced from my wife, you guessed that. But Amelia wasn't my daughter. She was my stepdaughter. I married her mother when I was just 20. Felicia was 25 at the time, and Amelia was 7. "Wow," Barbara said. "But I loved Amelia like my own daughter, and you also guessed right about the wallet. She bought it for me. She got it at some flea market with her pocket money. She gave it to me for my birthday. She was only 9 then and put a coin inside for luck. She asked me to always keep the wallet with me." Federico sighed. "I carried it with me all those years until she passed away." Barbara felt a chill run down her spine. "Whose death?" she asked hoarsely. The man, without blinking, stared somewhere beyond her. "Amelia's death. She had just turned 18. She finished school. Felicia and I attended her graduation, and the next morning, we found out she went for a ride in a car with her classmates. The driver was a guy who had already drunk quite a bit. The car skidded on the road, spun around, and crashed into a barrier. There were a guy and 2 girls in the back seat. They were injured, but everyone survived, while the driver and Amelia, who was sitting in the front seat, died on the spot." He fell silent. Barbara didn't know what to say or do in such situations. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. Federico nodded. "Felicia and I took it really hard. The worst part was that each of us dealt with it alone. I didn't even realize how we became strangers to each other." "And you divorced?" "Yes. 2 years ago." "I'm so sorry." He nodded again. "Actually, I didn't go crazy only because I was constantly working. I also kept the wallet that Amelia gave me. Then at some point, I decided it was time to let go of the past." Federico smirked. "I put money in the wallet so they wouldn't return it. And then you show up. If you didn't want the wallet to return to you, you wouldn't have put a card with an address in the pocket," Barbara pointed out. "That wasn't me." Emilia must have put it there when she gave it to me. I'm always losing everything, but I kept her wallet for all these years." Barbara shrugged. "Well, let's call it fate. Yeah, I have no other explanation. By the way," the boss suddenly squinted mischievously, "you've learned more than enough about me, and now I want to hear your story. How did you, someone so young, smart, beautiful, and honest, end up like this? Where are your parents, siblings, husband, and all the others?" "I don't know," Barbara answered honestly. "I was sent to an orphanage when I was very little. I don't remember my parents, and the caretakers never told me anything." "And you've never tried to find your family?" Federico asked. Barbara shook her head. "I ran away from there at 16, and since then, I've been moving from place to place. So that's how it is. Except for Leo and Carolina, I have no one. And haven't you thought about what you'll do next? While you're young and healthy, you can keep running from place to place, living in abandoned houses, and eating from dumpsters." Barbara blushed. The host felt he had overstepped and softened his tone. "I'm just worried about you," he said gently. "You're clearly worth more than this." The girl nodded and glanced at the clock. "If we're done for today, Senor Lorenzo, I'll go." "Go ahead, Barbara." On the way home, she kept thinking about the boss's words. Of course, Barbara knew that the life she was living wasn't the best option. But she always thought that just a little more and everything would change. But after her conversation with Federico, she suddenly realized that if she didn't change anything right now, she'd stay a dirty wanderer for the rest of her life. "I need to talk to the kids," Barbara thought. "I need to convince them that going to school is worth it. Maybe now, I can actually adopt them, contact some help center. I have a job now, I'm an adult, I can do something." When she approached the house, she noticed it was quiet and dark. Usually, they'd light a candle that could be seen through the window, but now their home looked completely abandoned. Did they really go to bed this early? Barbara thought. They shouldn't have. I even came back a little earlier today. "Carolina," she called. "Bruno." No response. The house was silent. "Guys?" Barbara called again. Then she realized it was cold inside. Usually, it was warm in the house. In summer, they wouldn't even bother heating the stove. But without electricity, the stove was the only way to cook food, boil water, or heat up water to bathe. But today, it seemed like the stove hadn't been lit, and there was no food on the stove. It felt like the kids had been gone for a while and hadn't come back. Barbara tried to calm herself and think about where they could have gone. For water? Their flask seemed to still be full. Maybe they ran off to play? But by now, they should have been back. They wouldn't leave her without dinner. All their meager belongings were in place. It felt like the kids had just disappeared into thin air. Barbara went outside, walked around the block. She wasn't closely acquainted with any of the locals. But she had no choice. She went to all the homeless people whose huts showed signs of life. But no one knew anything or had seen anything. That night, Barbara hardly slept. She listened to every sound, hoping the kids would come back soon. As soon as it began to get light, the girl got up and circled the entire block. No signs. There was nothing she could do. It was time to go to work. Maybe Federico could give her some advice. As Barbara was heading to the bus stop, she ran into Francisco, a man in his 50s, also from the area. "Oh, Barbara," he greeted her drunkenly. "Hello." Barbara replied politely. She was about to walk past him when the man suddenly asked, "Who took your kids yesterday?" Barbara turned around. "What? You saw who took Carolina and Bruno?" Vasilik nodded. "Yeah. In the afternoon, some car pulled up. A man and a woman got out, and they took your kids." Barbara swallowed. "Did they resist?" Francisco thought for a moment. "Seems like no, they just went with them." "Did you happen to catch the car's license plate?" No, I saw them from a distance, and I'd already had a drink by then. Thanks, Francisco. No problem. On one hand, Barbara felt a little relieved. At least she knew that yesterday afternoon, Bruno and Carolina were alive and well, and someone had taken them. But who? You seem a bit strange today, Federico said thoughtfully. What happened? The kids are missing. I came home yesterday, and they were gone. She told the boss everything, including the conversation with Francisco. Why didn't you tell me right away? Federico said. Let's think about how to search for them. What do you think? Right now, there are only two possibilities. Either it's the Child Protection Services, the police, or someone like that. They took the kids and sent them to an orphanage. Or it's some bad people who kidnapped Bruno and Carolina. The latter is what I'm most afraid of. Federico thought for a moment. I need to make a call. Wait here, he said, and went into another room. He returned a few minutes later. I called a friend of mine. He promised to find out, but he can't say how long it will take. Federico made breakfast, brewed coffee, and prepared sandwiches. You need to eat, he said sternly to Barbara. You'll need your strength. Yeah, she replied without much enthusiasm. After breakfast, the phone rang. Barbara jumped up and looked at Federico. He picked up the phone, greeted the caller, and began listening. From his expression, Barbara understood that there was news. What is it? She asked when Federico hung up. Let's go, he said shortly. Where? Have they found them? Yes. Barbara barely kept up with her boss. He opened the garage and pulled out the car. Barbara helped close the gates and sat in the front seat beside him. After fastening her seatbelt, she asked in a pleading voice, Please, tell me. Well, your good version turned out to be true. They were found by the police. They've been taken to the hospital for a checkup and some general tests. They're fine. Barbara exclaimed angrily. I've been taking care of them. I believe you, my dear, Federico responded calmly. But the police have their own rules. That's not even the main thing. What then? The main thing is that they didn't just start searching for them randomly. People came forward who want to adopt them, apparently relatives. Relatives? Barbara was surprised. Bruno and Carolina said they didn't know anything about any relatives. They're as much orphans as I am. Well, we'll get there and find out everything, Federico said softly. The whole way, Barbara was thinking about what she should do next. It seemed unlikely she could just take the kids back, especially with someone else wanting to adopt them. She blamed herself for not being with them at that moment, though her presence likely wouldn't have changed anything. At first, Barbara wasn't allowed to see the kids. Then Federico intervened. Whether he had some connections or just knew how to persuade people well, they agreed to let her in. Bruno and Carolina were placed in a separate room. There was a stern-looking woman, about 50 years old, in a suit sitting outside the door. Apparently, she had been warned about the visitors because she looked at Barbara with suspicion but let her in. Bruno, Carolina. Barbara called when she entered the room. The kids were sitting on the bed, hugging each other. When they saw their friend, they jumped up and, without saying a word, ran to her. Barbara, you found us. She hugged them, and tears rolled down her cheeks. I'm so happy. Barbara sighed. We thought we'd never see you again. Carolina sobbed. I knew you'd find us, Bruno mumbled stubbornly. Barbara smiled. How are you here? How are they treating you? The kids shrugged. It's okay, Bruno answered. Yesterday afternoon, the woman sitting in the hall and some guy came to our house. They were calm, said we shouldn't be afraid of them. They said they weren't going to send us to an orphanage. They told us there was a relative who has been looking for us for a long time. So it's true? Barbara gasped. Did you meet her? The kids shook their heads. She's probably Mom's older sister, Carolina added. She lived abroad and didn't know what happened to our parents or that we were in the orphanage. As soon as she found out, she came here. But we weren't there anymore, so she used some connections to find us. And she found you quickly, Barbara said thoughtfully. And I think she wants to adopt us, Bruno said. That's wonderful, Barbara said, forcing herself to smile. If she's a good person, I'll be happy for you. The kid sighed. We wanted to live with you, Carolina said. Barbara smiled sadly. You're growing up now, she answered. And you understand that the life we're living isn't really life, right? You can't always eat from the trash, wear rags, live in a house that's about to be torn down, and not go to school. The kids looked down sadly, but didn't say anything. At that moment, the door to the room opened, and their acquaintance from the hallway entered, accompanied by another woman, tall, slender, and dressed in expensive, stylish clothes. Barbara immediately liked the second woman. Her soft gray eyes scanned the room attentively, stopping on Bruno and Carolina. There was a clear resemblance to the children in her features. My name is Maria, the woman introduced herself. And for you, my nephews, I'm your aunt. Then, as if on impulse, she opened her arms, and the children rushed into her embrace, crying. After that, everyone, Barbara, Federico, the woman from the authorities, Maria, Bruno, and Carolina, sat in the room and talked. The last time I saw the kids was shortly before my sister's death, Maria said, stroking her nephew's hair. Back then, Bruno was 4, and Carolina was only 1. I remember you, the nephew suddenly said. You brought me a big plush tiger. Maria smiled and nodded. Then I left. I spent several years traveling around South America, living like a wild person, so to speak, studying the history, everyday life, and culture of the local people. I didn't have a permanent address or a phone. Even if someone had tried to contact me, they probably wouldn't have found any trace of my whereabouts. She sighed. I was just consumed by those travels. I was young, foolish, didn't even think about my sister. When I left, you had such a happy family. Only after many years did I meet a good man and marry him. And after settling down, I thought I should reach out to my relatives. That's when I found out everything. Luckily, now I have money. I spoke with my husband and bought a ticket here. That's when I learned you'd run away. I had to push hard for the authorities to start a proper search. She sighed again. I'm so happy I found you. Then Maria suddenly turned to Barbara. And I also have to thank you. You've been looking after my nephews all this time. Barbara blushed. Well, yes, she replied. Barbara is like a sister to us. Carolina shouted, and Bruno nodded vigorously. Maria smiled. I think it's already clear that I want to gain custody of my nephews. And I'd like to offer you, Barbara, to come live with us. For a few months, while the paperwork is being processed, we'll stay here, and then we'll go to my home. My husband and I have a huge estate there, and if you want, you can come with us. For some reason, Barbara glanced at Federico. He had been quietly standing behind them this whole time. Noticing her gaze, the boss smiled approvingly and nodded. Thank you for such a wonderful offer, Barbara replied. I'm very glad the children have found such a wonderful aunt. This is the best thing that's happened to us in all this time. And I really want to stay in touch with all of you and visit you, kids. But I think it's time for me to start building my own life. Barbara's heart twitched when she saw the children's faces fall. But she already knew she was doing the right thing. You don't want to live with us? Carolina asked sadly. Barbara tried to smile. I'll come visit you and call you. Bruno frowned. Is it because you're tired of us? He asked. No, not at all. Barbara said immediately. Of course not. Then Maria intervened. Maybe we should leave them alone for a while, she suggested to Federico and the woman from the authorities. All the adults left the room. Why didn't you go with the kids? The boss asked once they were in his car. Barbara sighed. I was thinking about your words, she confessed. About how it's time for me to start a normal adult life. She suddenly fell silent and stared out the window. Aren't we going to your place? Yeah, Federico said. How are you going to get to mine later? We're going to your place. Thank you, Barbara replied. So, what are your plans for the future? For now, I'll keep working for you, save some money, Barbara answered. While I also figure out my documents. Maybe later, I'll rent an apartment and go back to school. Serious goals. What's next? During the conversation, Barbara hadn't noticed how they had entered the abandoned neighborhood. I'll go on my own from here, the girl protested. She was embarrassed to show the boss where she lived. Federico frowned. Don't be a child, Barbara. Left at the end of the street. Federico nodded and drove the car in the indicated direction. Here's my house, Barbara said angrily. She got out of the car, slammed the door, and walked off without looking back, not even saying goodbye or thanking her boss. When she opened the door and entered, she was about to collapse on the bed and burst into tears when she heard Federico's voice behind her. You've made it quite cozy here. I expected worse. Barbara jumped and turned around. The boss was calmly inspecting her home, as if it were the most normal house, not a rundown shelter for 3 homeless kids that should have been demolished 15 years ago. Do you heat the stove? Where do you get firewood? You've divided the area into separate zones. Original. Why did you follow me? Barbara asked angrily. He looked at her in surprise, as if the answer were obvious. You said you were going to start a new life, start renting a place. Yes, but why don't you stay with me for now? You won't have to spend money on travel, and you won't need to get up at 6 in the morning. The girl looked at him distrustfully. Senor Lorenzo, are you offering me to move in with you? Temporarily, Barbara, temporarily. Otherwise, you might think I'm proposing marriage. I would never think that, she muttered indignantly. The boss smiled cheerfully. So, am I too old for you? No, of course not. He smiled even wider. Then, what? Not handsome enough? You're handsome. Barbara suddenly realized that he was purposely embarrassing her. It seemed like he was enjoying it. I can't live with you, that's all, she snapped. Why? Well, just think about how it will look. He pretended to think for a moment. So, living in a house about to be torn down with no electricity, heating, or plumbing looks fine, but mine doesn't. If you don't trust me, Federico started. Of course, I trust you. Barbara interrupted him irritably. Her head was starting to hurt from all these arguments. Let's go, Barbara sighed. I'll pack my things, it'll take 5 minutes. She didn't have much stuff, just clothes and shoes. She didn't take the old dishes or bed linen. The kids definitely wouldn't need them, and she wouldn't bring such things into her boss's house. Packed in 10 minutes, Federico said when she got into the car. Perfect woman. You're such a jokester. I am, Federico confirmed meekly, starting the car. A couple of days later, Barbara visited Bruno and Carolina. They were living with their aunt in a luxurious private house that Maria had rented while the guardianship paperwork was being prepared. How are you? Barbara asked. The brother and sister looked absolutely happy. Barbara looked at them, so clean, well-groomed, and in new beautiful clothes. They were completely unrecognizable from the homeless kids they had been. Looking at them, no one would have guessed they had once lived on the streets and eaten from trash bins. We're good, Bruno replied. Aunt Maria is very kind and fun, Carolina added. She tells us a lot about Mom. I'm happy for you, Barbara said. Maybe you'll live with us? Carolina asked. We miss you, her brother admitted. Barbara sighed. I miss you too. But you're happy now. The kids nodded, and she smiled. Then I don't need anything else. After spending time together, Maria came in and invited Barbara to stay for lunch. The four of them had lunch together. Maria talked about how things were going with the paperwork. She also offered to help Barbara restore her passport, insurance, and other documents. "I also have a little gift for you," Maria said, handing Barbara a small box. Barbara opened it. "Is this a phone?" "Yes, Carolina and Bruno will have one too. You'll always be able to stay in touch." "Thank you," Barbara said. "But this is too expensive, and I can't accept it." Maria shook her head and took her hand. "Barbara, my dear," she said softly, "you've taken care of my nephews all this time, fed them, clothed them, found them a home. I can never thank you enough for that, though I really want to. So please let me do this small thing for you." "All right, thank you." At Federico's, Barbara settled in a room that she had previously thought was a guest room. Later, she realized it was the room where his stepdaughter had once lived. Of course, there was almost nothing left of that now. It was just a regular bed, a wardrobe, a desk, a computer chair, a mirror, and a vanity. "I wonder where her things are," Barbara thought. "Did they put them in the garage or the basement? Or did Amelia's mother take them?" The first few days, it felt strange waking up in this house. However, Barbara quickly adjusted to the new surroundings. After a few days, she no longer found it surprising that she had her own shower and toilet, whereas the previous year she had washed in a summer shower or with a basin. It was great that she didn't have to wake up at the crack of dawn for work anymore. Now, Barbara woke up at 7:30, went to the shower, washed her face, went downstairs, and habitually made breakfast for two. By then, Federico was also getting up. They had breakfast together, and then he would go to work, while Barbara took care of the cleaning. She was now doing it quickly, and she had plenty of free time left. "I've finished everything. Are there any other tasks?" Barbara asked her boss every day. He would sometimes send her to the store, sometimes to the post office to send old manuscripts with notes and pick up new ones, or ask her to buy something at the market. A few days later, he said, "Somehow, you're not a normal employee, Barbara. Normal people are happy when there's no work, but you're the opposite, you're looking for work. I just can't do nothing. Then spend this time productively for yourself. Work on your documents, think about which university you want to apply to, and everything else." Federico even found an old laptop and gave it to Barbara. He showed her how to use it. "This way, your work will go faster," he said. A couple of weeks later, with Maria's help and influence, all of Barbara's documents were ready. "Now I'm officially a person," Barbara said thoughtfully to her boss, looking at her new passport. "That's very good," he replied. "I'm happy for you." 3 months later, Barbara and Federico were at the airport, seeing off Maria, Bruno, and Carolina. Barbara hugged them and couldn't believe that she wouldn't see her kids again for quite some time. "As soon as we arrive, we'll get local SIM cards," Maria said. "Then you'll be able to talk to each other every day via video call." Barbara smiled. She could see that the kids were just happy. And she was genuinely happy for them. They hugged one last time. Barbara and Federico waved at them for a long time until they disappeared behind the security check zone. "How do you feel?" the boss asked once they were in the car. "All right. I've thought so many times about how things will turn out for all of us. And this is such a great option for Carolina and Bruno, I couldn't even imagine it in my wildest dreams. Now I can just be happy for them." "How quickly you've grown up, my dear," he said. "Girls your age shouldn't be thinking about such serious things. Most of your peers are in university, living carefree and happy lives. You talk like an old man. But you're not much older than me. I could almost be your father. I don't know. You look like my older brother." Federico pretended to think. "Let's go somewhere to eat." "I can cook at home," Barbara protested. "Relax, woman," Federico replied cheerfully. "Consider today your day off. I hardly do anything all day anyway. I cook a little and clean. It only takes a couple of hours. Maybe you're right, he said. You really don't work enough. We need to fix this immediately. Don't look at me so frightened, it's your fault. He explained his idea to Barbara during lunch. I've been asked to be a consultant on a film shoot. They have the main script, but they're unsure about some details. They offered me to supervise the whole filming process. I'll need to be on set all the time. And of course, I'll need an assistant. Barbara looked at him in surprise. You want to take me as your assistant? Yes. The whole thing will wrap up in the spring. You'll gain some experience, and maybe you'll want to pursue something in a similar field. To be a screenwriter? Not necessarily. A director, cameraman, sound technician, or even an actress. I agree. Barbara enjoyed being on set. There was some completely unique atmosphere there. She hadn't imagined that films were made in such chaos. A huge number of people were running around like crazy, back and forth without a break. On the first day, Barbara was afraid she'd get knocked over. She didn't leave Federico's side. He smiled, seeing her scared expression. Don't worry, he said during a break. I almost lost my mind when I first came here. You'll get used to it in a couple of days. I'm scared, Barbara admitted honestly. They're all crazy here. That's true, and soon, you'll be just like them. Barbara looked at him skeptically, but her boss didn't seem to be joking. You haven't seen me at work yet. When you do, don't be scared. At first, Barbara didn't understand what he meant. But then, the director and Federico had a falling out. Barbara had never seen her boss so angry. You called me to turn this pointless nonsense into something resembling a film, and that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Federico shouted. I'm doing the same thing, the director yelled back. And I know better what this scene should look like. What surprised Barbara most was how the other people present, actors, the assistant director, makeup artists, and cameramen, watched this. They didn't care at all, as if nothing strange was happening. Apparently, that was the norm. Because 15 minutes later, when everyone took a break, Barbara saw Federico and the director chatting peacefully by the coffee machine. Is this normal for you? She asked one of the cameramen. He didn't immediately understand what she meant. What, did they argue on set? How else would it go? If you don't shout, you don't shoot. In the evening, Federico asked his new assistant. So, what do you think? There's some kind of magic in all this, especially when we watch the completed scene. I'm so glad you felt that. After all these years, I still can't get used to the magic of it. It's a completely unique atmosphere. Barbara suddenly realized that they were standing in the kitchen, cooking dinner together. What are you doing? She exclaimed in surprise. Federico froze. The water is boiling. I want to put the pasta in, he replied. What's the problem? I've salted it. Cooking dinner is my job. Sometimes you're just unbearably stubborn. We'll finish faster together. But it's my job, Barbara repeated stubbornly. I get paid for it. The boss sighed. We'll finish faster and go to bed. Please, don't forget we have to wake up early tomorrow. I'll make breakfast myself, she said stubbornly. Federico snorted but didn't say anything. A month later, Barbara suddenly realized that she had gotten used to this life. She could hardly imagine that she had once been homeless, rummaging through trash cans for expired sausages. Now she had a job, strictly speaking, even two, and plans to apply to university next year and find an apartment. Strange, but Barbara didn't really want to do any of that. Sometimes she even thought that she was in love with her boss. Until then, Barbara had never fallen in love with anyone, so she had nothing to compare it to. But she knew for sure that she involuntarily smiled every time she heard his footsteps in the morning when Federico went to the kitchen for breakfast. She was also ready to stand behind his chair for hours, listening to him explain to the crew how and why a particular scene should be done. She had become a different person. Barbara watched as his blue eyes sparkled under his glasses, how his hair was slightly disheveled at the crown, and a drop of sweat ran down his temple. She thought that she had never seen anyone more attractive. Sometimes she even thought that Federico looked at her in a special way. At times, Barbara allowed herself to fantasize that he liked her too, but then she would pull herself together and push those bold thoughts away. No, a man like Federico Lorenzo would never notice someone like Barbara. He only tolerates her out of kindness. And also because he was very sad and lonely, and for some reason, only Barbara had been around for the past few months. Now she saw how he literally blossomed with every day spent on set. When all of this ended, she would go to university and move out. Federico would forget about Barbara in a few days. The thought of it made her sad. But Barbara decided that she would enjoy the time she had now. And now, they were together almost all the time. Apart from him, Barbara only spoke to colleagues at work. Well, sometimes, when she had the energy, she would call Bruno and Carolina. The kids were doing well. They were exploring the vast estate, marveling at the local cuisine and the mild climate. Aunt Maria's husband also liked them. He turned out to be kind and hospitable, treating Bruno and Carolina like his own nephews. "How are your kids doing?" Federico asked her when Barbara hung up. "They're fine. They say hello to you," Barbara replied. "Thanks." Federico suddenly hesitated and then asked, "How about we go out for dinner tonight?" Barbara looked at him in surprise. "I've already made schnitzels with mashed potatoes. Don't you like them?" He smiled softly. "I like everything you cook. We'll leave them for tomorrow. I just feel like going for a walk tonight." Federico took them to a small but cozy restaurant. Barbara was worried that she would be very embarrassed because she had never been to a restaurant. But the waiter led them to a separate table, which was divided from the main hall by translucent partitions. There, Barbara immediately felt protected. Besides, Federico was right there, and she always felt good and calm with him. "What will you have?" She scanned the menu with her eyes. "I don't know, maybe you choose?" Barbara asked. After they placed their order, Barbara looked around. "I like it here," she confessed. "Got it. We'll come here more often." "That's not what I mean." "But that's what I mean." He looked at her, frowning slightly, but still with a smile. "I think we're having a wonderful time together. Or do you disagree?" Barbara blushed slightly and lowered her gaze. "I don't want to get used to this," she said quietly. "Get used to what?" Federico didn't understand. "Spending so much time with you, getting attached, thinking that this will last a long time." Barbara raised her gaze to him and suddenly saw Federico's face go pale. He had already opened his mouth and wanted to say something when a woman's voice interrupted them. "So, it's all true? I thought it was just rumors." Barbara saw that a beautiful woman was standing by their table. She immediately recognized her. It was Felicia, Federico's ex-wife, the mother of his late stepdaughter, Emilia. "Good evening, Felicia," Federico greeted calmly. "What are you doing here?" "I came to have dinner, and what a meeting this is." The woman looked at Barbara with such contempt that Barbara felt a shiver run down her spine. "I've been told more than once that you're having an affair with your young assistant. And even that she's supposedly living with you. I didn't believe that you'd sink so low. But, I guess, breaking up with me and being lonely has taken its toll." Federico straightened up calmly. "Barbara works for me, and between us, it's strictly professional. In any case, it's none of your business." "Is that so?" thought Barbara. "So, just professional, huh? I guess it was only me who thought there was something more between us." She straightened her back and pressed her lips together, trying not to cry. "Just not now, not in front of Federico and this awful woman." "It's none of my business?" Felicia repeated. "We were married for so many years, you considered Emilia your daughter." Federico sighed heavily. "I loved Emilia with all my heart, you know that. And me? The woman asked insistently. At that point, Barbara couldn't take it anymore. I'll go, she quickly said, getting up from the table. You really need to talk. She almost ran out of the restaurant, getting dressed as she went. She had the keys to the house and money for a taxi. Barbara suddenly thought that maybe she didn't need to go back. But then she quickly snapped herself out of it. Where would she go then? The street? No. Of course, she had survival experience. Even now, in winter. But was it really worth running away at the first sign of trouble again? Now that she had a job, a place to live, the opportunity to gain new experiences, and her future was at stake, would she really throw it all away over something so trivial? No, of course, Federico was not trivial. She had already realized that he occupied too much space in her heart, far more than an employer or even a good friend should. Well, what now? She was still practically nobody to him. Especially now, with his ex-wife, the woman he had loved for so many years, the one with whom he had been through so much. At home, she was tired. She took off her shoes and hung up her coat. It was so quiet and empty without Federico. She washed her face and lay down to sleep but couldn't fall asleep. She heard Federico return only 2 hours later. He even quietly opened the door to her room. Barbara pretended to be asleep. The next day, neither of them said a word about what had happened. Federico looked very thoughtful. His wife must have suggested they start over, Barbara thought. And now he's deciding whether to agree or not. Of course, he'll agree in the end. On the outside, she tried not to show that it troubled her. But inside, the pain and longing were tearing her apart. Why is life so unfair? Why, as soon as she begins to have people close to her, does fate immediately take them away? Of course, it's good that things have worked out for the kids. And Federico will probably be happy with his Felicia. But that doesn't make it easier for Barbara. But she'll endure. She had never faced a challenge in life that she couldn't overcome. And she would get through this first heartache too. You've been acting strange lately, Federico said to her. You've lost weight, and you're quiet all the time. It's like you're thinking about something. Has someone hurt you, maybe me? Everything's fine, just tired from work. Want me to give you a little vacation? Stay home for a week, get some rest. You won't have to cook or clean either, I'll take care of it. Trying to be gentle with me before Felicia comes and shows who's in charge around here, Barbara thought. Well, no. I'll leave before she gets here. No, I don't want a vacation, she replied stubbornly. You're the most stubborn girl in the world, you know that? As if you're not, Barbara said. You can barely stand on your feet but still argue with the director until the very end. I'm only standing thanks to you. When I see the way you look at me, suddenly, I find strength from nowhere. You always say I need to gain experience, so I'm listening to how you yell at everyone. He laughed. Well, I thought I could hope it was my irresistible beauty, charisma, and oratory skills. Why is he teasing me like this? Barbara thought. He surely understands that I like him. How cruel it is to laugh at my feelings, especially now, when he's about to get back together with his ex-wife. She raised her head proudly and answered. In any case, we don't have much time left to work together. The shooting will end soon. It will end, Federico didn't argue. But we'll still be together, at least in my house. How much she wished for that to be forever. Then I'll have to go to university. I won't be able to study and work for you at the same time. I'm not asking you to. Federico frowned. I'll live in a dorm once I get in, Barbara added. And if you need me to leave the room earlier, I'll go sooner. Her boss raised his eyebrows in surprise and wanted to say something, but didn't have the chance. The break was over, and everyone was invited back to the set. A few days later, they had their first real day off. So, what do you say, shall we go somewhere? Federico asked cheerfully. Barbara hesitated. I don't know, I haven't done a big cleaning in a while. Forget about it, the house is clean. We're hardly ever here anyway. Let's have some fun instead. Last night was ruined before it even started. Fine, Barbara sighed. They were just discussing where to go when Federico received a message. He looked at the screen and sighed. How does she do this? Then he turned his gaze to Barbara and smiled apologetically. Sorry, sunshine, the walk is off for today. My ex-wife is coming over. Looks like we're going to have an interesting conversation now. I understand, she replied. I'll be in my room. There, she sat down on the bed. Federico smiled strangely. Maybe now they were finally going to make up and decide to live together. So, what was she waiting for here? She stood up decisively. Felicia's voice was already audible downstairs. She arrived quickly. Barbara began calmly packing her things. She didn't want to leave demonstratively while the ex-spouses were talking. She decided to wait until everything calmed down, then quietly slip out of the house. Tonight, she could stay in a hostel, and tomorrow she would think about an apartment. Maybe she would rent a room with someone for now. After all, she had survived on the street for so many years, she would manage under more comfortable conditions. Finally, the voices quieted down. Barbara waited a few more minutes for good measure, then took her suitcase, peeked out of the room, and went to the front door. And where do you think you're going? Suddenly, Federico's voice came from behind her. He was standing in the doorway with a mug in his hands. Tea? He asked, showing her the mug. Barbara shook her head. All right, then tell me, what's with this secret relocation? Did I offend you in some way? Or do you have a secret admirer, and you're sneaking off to him, not wanting to break my heart? I just didn't want to disturb your idyll of reunion with your ex-wife. What? Federico looked genuinely surprised. Sunshine, are you jealous of me? Barbara felt herself blush. Don't be ridiculous, she said in a trembling voice, like I have nothing better to do. Let's go to the kitchen, Federico sighed. Seems like we've got a misunderstanding between us. In the kitchen, he practically forced her to sit at the table and poured her a big mug of tea. Talk to me, Federico demanded. What's going on? Barbara raised her eyes to him. What do you want to hear? She asked. I don't even know. Probably everything. I thought we were getting along great, and then suddenly, you're packing your things and trying to run away without even warning me. I understand that you and Felicia are getting back together, and I don't want to get in the way. Where are you getting these conclusions from? I'm not completely naive, Barbara almost screamed. You were talking for about 2 hours in the restaurant, and after that, you didn't seem like yourself. You kept pacing around, thinking about something, and then today, she showed up. Women. You're driving me crazy. He sighed. There's nothing going on between me and Felicia. That day in the restaurant, she happened to run into us and wanted to have a confrontation. After you left, we just talked. She even cried at the end about Amelia. I sat with her and sent her home. And today? Barbara asked quietly. Today, she came to apologize. She even wanted to talk to you, but I told her it was better not to. She left. Barbara looked at him skeptically. You're not getting back together with her? He smiled. No. Besides, I've already liked another girl for a long time. Who? Stop teasing me, you understand everything perfectly. You don't mean me, do you? Why, is that interesting? Because I'm homeless, poor, and uneducated. You know how to pick your words, but you forgot to mention how amazing, smart, honest, kind, caring, beautiful, and strong you are. So, do you actually like me? Like you? I've been in love with you for a very long time. She blushed. Then why didn't you say anything? Her boss looked awkwardly away. Because I didn't think a young and beautiful girl like you would be interested in a boring and pedantic old man like me. Barbara laughed and suddenly threw herself at him, kissing him. "I guess you're not as smart as I thought," she said after the kiss. "You've also taken too long to notice the obvious things. I hope we won't miss anything important together." Federico hugged her and pulled her close. "Yeah, now we'll have to make an effort."
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.